Good evening, all, and welcome back to Farcical Fears. At 3 a.m., Marcus heard someone circling his tent, speaking in his own voice. When he looked outside, he saw himself standing there, grinning. That was story 7. But it gets worse. Tonight you're going to hear about a fake ranger who knew things he shouldn't know. 4 silent men who dragged a camper into complete darkness, and something in the woods that mimicked their voices perfectly. You'll hear about a family stalked for days before their car was disabled. Photos of a man taped to trees that were taken that morning while he was alone, and his friends standing outside watching him while they were all asleep in their tents. You'll discover 50 human teeth arranged in a circle around where he slept. A grizzly that hunted them for 9 hours. Lights in the forest that her uncle documented for 20 years that aren't lights at all. And children who died in 1995 still playing at their campsite. These are 10 true camping horror stories. Some survived, some didn't. All of them are true. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Farcical Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Let's begin. Story 1. The Fake Ranger. Marcus was crouched inside his tent at 4 a.m., listening to a man circle his campsite for the 6th hour straight. The man was wearing Marcus's face, speaking in Marcus's voice, calling out to Elena using inside jokes only Marcus would know. But Marcus was right here, trembling, watching his own silhouette move past the tent wall. Let me explain how they got there. 2 days earlier, Marcus and Elena had arrived at a permitted mountain trail in late September. Both were experienced hikers who'd done this route 3 times before. They set up camp in their usual spot, a clearing surrounded by pine trees with a perfect view of the valley below. Everything felt normal until that first nightfall. That's when the man appeared. He claimed to be a park ranger, but something was immediately wrong. No uniform, no headlamp, no radio. Just an unsettling grin that seemed too wide for his face, stretching in a way that didn't look quite human. But what happened next changed everything. He told them the area was closed due to a situation and insisted they follow him immediately into the woods. When Marcus asked to see identification, the man recited their entire hiking itinerary, every campsite they'd booked, every trail they planned to take, even the exact time they'd arrived that afternoon. Information he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd been watching them for days. Elena whispered her question with fear cracking her voice. The man smiled wider and said he also knew they were planning to leave tomorrow at 6:47 a.m. That's a very specific time, Marcus. Why exactly 6:47? Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd never told anyone that detail. He'd only thought it to himself that morning while packing the car. They refused to follow him. That's when his behavior shifted completely. The grin disappeared. His eyes went flat and dead. Without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness beyond their firelight. For exactly 3 minutes, there was silence. Then they heard footsteps circling their campsite, always just beyond what they could see. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, crunching through fallen leaves in a slow, deliberate circle. What they didn't know was that he would circle them for the next 9 hours without stopping once. Every 20 minutes, he would appear at the edge of their firelight in a different direction each time, just staring, never speaking, never blinking. His head tilted at an angle that made him look like a curious predator studying prey. And here's what made it worse. He started wearing different clothes each time he appeared. The first time, he wore a dark jacket. The second time, a flannel shirt. The third time, He was wearing clothes that looked exactly like what Marcus was wearing. At 2 a.m., Elena grabbed Marcus's arm hard enough to leave marks. "He's wearing your jacket now, the one you're wearing right now." It was impossible, but there he stood 30 feet away, dressed identically to Marcus, down to the tear in the left sleeve from that morning's hike. Then came the voices. From 3 different directions around their camp, they heard Marcus calling Elena's name in his exact voice, with his exact inflection. Then Elena's voice calling Marcus from somewhere else entirely. The voices knew conversations they'd had earlier that day. Private conversations, whispered conversations inside their tent that no one could have overheard. Marcus heard himself saying, "I love you," in the same tone he'd used an hour earlier. Elena heard herself laughing at a joke she'd made at dinner. The voices overlapped, creating a horrible chorus of themselves calling to each other from the darkness. But what happened next was worse than anything they could have imagined. At 3:30 a.m., they heard their own voices having a conversation outside the tent. Marcus and Elena sat frozen inside, listening to themselves discussing whether to go for help or wait until morning. The conversation was detailed and natural, exactly how they would talk to each other. Then their voices outside started arguing about something they'd actually argued about 6 months ago, word for word, including things neither of them had told anyone else. By 5 a.m., Marcus made a decision. They would run at first light. When dawn finally broke, they packed in complete silence. The footsteps had stopped. The voices had stopped. Everything was quiet. They ran. They didn't look back. They didn't stop until they reached their car 2 miles down the trail. Marcus's hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. They drove straight to the ranger station and reported everything. The ranger on duty looked at them with an expression that Marcus would never forget. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. The ranger pulled up a map and asked them to point to exactly where they'd camped. When Marcus pointed to the location, the ranger closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He said there was no ranger assigned to that area, and there hadn't been for 3 years since budget cuts. He also said this wasn't the first report they'd received. 3 weeks earlier, a solo hiker had reported a man claiming to be a ranger who knew impossible details about his life. That hiker had followed the man into the woods. They found his abandoned campsite 2 days later. His tent was still set up, his food was still on the table, and his wallet and phone were still in his backpack. But the hiker was gone. They never found him. The ranger told Marcus and Elena they were lucky they didn't follow him. He said whatever that thing was, it had been active in those mountains for at least 5 years based on disappearance patterns. It studies people, learns them, copies them, and then it takes them somewhere. No one knows where. Marcus and Elena never went camping again. But sometimes, late at night, Marcus hears his own voice calling to him from outside, his bedroom window. And when he looks out, there's nothing there. Just footprints in the morning dew, circling his house. Story 2. The 4 men. Graham was being dragged backward into complete darkness, away from his campfire, away from any light, with a hand clamped over his mouth and another gripping his jacket. 3 other men were systematically destroying his tent behind him, ripping through his gear with practiced efficiency. They hadn't said a single word, not one. And that silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Let me explain how he got there. Graham had arrived at the remote lake that afternoon, a spot he'd camped at dozens of times over the past 5 years. It was his escape, a place where he could be completely alone with his thoughts. He set up his tent near the water's edge, started a fire as the sun began to set, and cooked a simple meal. Everything was peaceful. Across the lake, maybe half a mile away, He noticed some silhouettes moving near the opposite shore. Other campers, he assumed. He thought nothing of it and settled in for the evening, watching the flames dance and listening to the water lap against the rocks. But what happened next changed everything. Around 9 p.m., without any warning, without any sound of approach, 4 men emerged from the tree line directly behind him. They didn't call out a greeting. They didn't ask if they could join him. They simply walked into his campsite like they owned it. Graham turned around and froze. All 4 were in their 30s or 40s, wearing dark clothing, and their faces were completely expressionless. Dead eyes. No emotion whatsoever. Before Graham could even stand up or say a word, 2 of them went straight for his tent and began tearing through it, unzipping compartments, dumping out his belongings, searching for something. Graham finally found his voice and demanded to know what they were doing. They didn't answer. They didn't even look at him. That's when the other 2 men moved toward him. One grabbed his arm, the other grabbed the back of his jacket, and they started pulling him away from the fire. Graham tried to resist, tried to plant his feet, but they were stronger, and they moved with disturbing coordination, like they'd done this before. They dragged him backward, away from the light, into the darkness of the forest. His mind was screaming at him to fight, to run, to do something. But his body felt frozen with shock. Here's what made it worse. As they pulled him deeper into the trees, one of the men reached into his jacket pocket. Graham couldn't see what he was reaching for in the darkness, but the gesture was deliberate and purposeful. A weapon, a rope, zip ties. Graham's imagination filled in the horrifying blanks. In that split second, survival instinct finally kicked in. He twisted hard, broke free from their grip, and ran. He didn't look back. He didn't try to grab anything. He just ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him, pure adrenaline propelling him forward toward where he thought he'd parked his truck. But what happened next still haunts him. As he crashed through the undergrowth, gasping for air, he realized something. He couldn't hear them chasing him. No footsteps, no voices calling after him, no sounds of pursuit at all. Just silence behind him. That somehow made it worse, because he couldn't know if they were following or if they'd let him go. He reached his truck, fumbled with his keys, got the door open, and locked himself inside. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. He sat there for a moment, engine running, staring back toward the campsite through the darkness. They hadn't followed him. Why hadn't they followed him? He waited 15 minutes, catching his breath, trying to process what had just happened. Then he drove straight to the nearest town and called the police. 2 officers accompanied him back to the lake just after midnight. When they arrived at his campsite, the 4 men were gone, completely vanished. But his campsite had been absolutely ransacked. His tent was shredded, his sleeping bag torn open, his backpack emptied with contents scattered everywhere. His food supplies were untouched. His wallet was still in his jacket pocket with all his cash and cards. They hadn't stolen anything. The officers searched the area with flashlights. They found boot prints everywhere, multiple sets, all large sizes. The prints led into the forest in several directions, but eventually disappeared into rocky terrain where tracking became impossible. One officer examined the tent and said the cuts looked deliberate, made with a knife, systematic. The other officer asked Graham if he had any enemies, anyone who might have followed him there. Graham said no. He was a middle school teacher. He lived alone. He had no conflicts with anyone. This was random. But here's the part that keeps Graham awake at night. One of the officers found something near the fire pit that Graham hadn't noticed in his panic. A small digital camera placed on a rock, facing directly where Graham had been sitting. It was still recording. The officers reviewed the footage, and their expressions changed. They told Graham he should probably avoid this area for a while. They wouldn't tell him what was on the recording, but they confiscated the camera as evidence. Graham filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. No arrests, no leads. The case went cold. Graham never went camping alone again. But sometimes he wonders what those men were looking for. What was in that jacket pocket? Why they let him run? And what was on that camera recording that made those officers' faces go pale? He requested the footage through a Freedom of Information request 6 months later. The request was denied. The camera was listed as lost evidence. Graham moved to a different state the following year, but he still checks over his shoulder. Still can't shake the feeling that 4 silent men might emerge from darkness at any moment. Story 3. The Voice Mimic. Bethany heard her own voice screaming for help from the woods, begging someone to find her, saying she was lost and scared. But Bethany was sitting right there at the campfire, frozen in terror, listening to herself cry out from the darkness. Then Cole heard his voice calling from a completely different direction. Then Raj heard his voice. All 3 of them calling simultaneously from different points around their campsite, their voices overlapping, creating an impossible chorus of themselves begging for help. Something in those woods had learned their voices perfectly, and now it was using them. Let me explain how they got there. 3 friends, Bethany, Cole, and Raj, had driven up to the Appalachian backcountry for a fall camping trip. They'd been planning this for months, wanting to see the autumn leaves at their peak and get away from the city for a long weekend. They arrived at their campsite in the early afternoon, set up their tents in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, and spent the day hiking nearby trails. Everything felt perfect. The weather was cool but comfortable. The scenery was breathtaking, and they had the entire area to themselves. As darkness fell, they built a fire and settled in to cook dinner and tell stories. But what happened next changed everything. Around 10 p.m., they heard rustling in the bushes about 30 feet from their campsite. At first, they assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon looking for food. Cole grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing. The rustling stopped. They laughed it off and went back to their conversation. Then, about 10 minutes later, they heard it again, but closer this time. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like something large moving through the undergrowth in a circle around them. Raj stood up and called out, asking if anyone was there. No response, just more rustling, now from a different direction. Then came the voice, Bethany's voice, calling from deep in the woods. "Help me, I'm lost. Please help me, I can't find the campsite." The 3 of them went silent. Bethany felt her blood run cold because she was sitting right there. She hadn't moved, she hadn't spoken. Cole looked at her with wide eyes and whispered, "That's your voice. That's exactly your voice." The voice called out again, closer now, with perfect inflection, with the exact tone Bethany used when she was scared. "Please, I can't see anything. Where are you guys?" Raj grabbed his flashlight and stood up, ready to investigate, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank. But then he heard his own voice. From the opposite direction, Raj's voice called out, "Guys, something's following me. I think it's a bear. Help." But Raj was standing right there next to the fire, flashlight in hand, mouth open in shock. He hadn't said those words. The voice was coming from the darkness beyond the tree line, but it was unmistakably his voice, his cadence, even his slight accent. Then Cole's voice joined in from a third direction. "Did you hear that? I think something's watching us." All 3 voices continued calling out, overlapping each other, creating a disorienting wall of sound that surrounded their campsite. Their own voices, speaking words they'd never said, coming from the darkness. Here's what made it worse. The voices started having conversations. Bethany's voice said, "Should we go look for it?" Cole's voice responded, "I don't know. This feels wrong." Raj's voice said, "Maybe we should pack up and leave." These were things they might actually say. But the conversation was happening out there in the woods, not at the campfire where they sat paralyzed with fear. Then the voices began repeating things they'd actually said earlier that day, word for word. Bethany heard herself saying, "I'm so glad we came here. This place is beautiful," which was exactly what she'd said that afternoon during their hike. Cole heard himself laughing and making a joke he'd told at dinner. Raj heard himself talking about work, a private conversation he'd had with Cole while Bethany was in her tent. But what happened next was even more terrifying. Something large moved between the trees, just beyond the reach of their firelight. They could see its shadow, massive and hunched, moving from tree to tree in a circle around them. And as it moved, all three voices continued simultaneously, now coming from wherever the shadow was. The thing was mimicking them in real time, switching between their voices, sometimes mid-sentence. Bethany's voice would start a sentence, and Cole's voice would finish it. The shadow circled them for what felt like hours, always staying just outside the light, always moving, always speaking in their voices. They made a decision without even discussing it. They scrambled into one tent, the largest one, and huddled together in complete silence. They could hear it outside, circling the tent, pressing against the fabric, making the walls bulge inward. The voices continued all night long, sometimes screaming, sometimes whispering, sometimes pleading. At one point, Bethany's voice whispered right next to the tent wall, inches from her head. "Let me in. Please let me in. I'm so cold out here." The tent wall pressed inward, as if something was leaning against it. None of them slept. They sat back to back, flashlights on, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, the voices stopped. The rustling stopped. Everything went silent. They waited 30 minutes before unzipping the tent. Cole went out first, and what he found made him call the others immediately. Around their entire campsite, in a perfect circle, were footprints. But they weren't human footprints. They were massive, at least twice the size of a human foot, with long claw marks extending from the toes. Whatever had circled them all night had walked on two legs, but was definitely not human. The prints were deep, pressed into the soft earth, indicating something incredibly heavy. They packed up in record time, not speaking, barely breathing. As they loaded their cars, Raj noticed something carved into a tree at the edge of their campsite. Fresh carvings, done recently, maybe even that night. 3 sets of initials, B, C, and R. Their initials. Below the initials was a tally mark. They drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything. The ranger listened to their story with an expression that wasn't quite skepticism, but wasn't quite belief either. He pulled out a map and asked them to mark their exact campsite location. When they pointed to it, he nodded slowly and closed the map. The ranger told them they weren't the first to report something like this in that area. Over the past 15 years, there had been at least a dozen similar reports. Voices mimicking campers, large bipedal footprints, things circling campsites at night. Local people had stories about it going back generations. Some called it a Wendigo, others a skinwalker, others just called it the mimic. The ranger said most people dismissed it as folklore or overactive imaginations. But the reports were too consistent, too detailed, too similar to ignore. He told them they were lucky. Some campers who'd reported the mimic were never quite right afterward. Some never came back at all. Bethany, Cole, and Raj never returned to those woods. But sometimes, late at night, each of them hears the other's voices calling to them from outside their windows. Bethany lives 3 states away from Cole now, but she still hears his voice sometimes, asking her to come outside. Cole hears Raj's voice, even though Raj moved to another country. And Raj hears both of them, calling to him in the darkness, using words they'd never say, trying to lure him out. They don't talk about it anymore, but they know. Whatever learned their voices that night in the Appalachian woods is still out there, still calling, still waiting. Story 4. The Stalked Family. Sophie was lying perfectly still in her sleeping bag, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to her entire family being murdered around her. She could hear the heavy footsteps moving between tents, the muffled sounds, her mother's cut-off scream, her father's struggle. The man had been watching them for 4 days, learning their routine, waiting for this exact moment. Sophie knew that if she moved, if she made a single sound, she would be next. So she played dead, barely breathing, tears running silently down her face. Let me explain how they got there. The Peterson family had arrived in British Columbia for what was supposed to be the camping trip of a lifetime. David and Ann Peterson, their 2 daughters Sophie and Lily, and Ann's elderly parents had rented a remote campsite deep in Wells Gray Provincial Park. They wanted isolation, wanted to truly disconnect from the modern world for a week. They got more isolation than they bargained for. The first 2 days were absolutely perfect. They hiked, fished in the nearby lake, cooked meals over the campfire, and enjoyed being together as a family. David even joked that this was the most peaceful he'd felt in years. But what happened next changed everything. On the 3rd morning, David noticed something odd. Small items around their campsite had been moved. His fishing tackle box was on the opposite side of the picnic table from where he'd left it. Ann's hiking boots were lined up differently. Lily's sketchbook was open to a page she hadn't been working on. At first, David thought he was misremembering where he'd placed things. But that afternoon, while the family was out on a hike, David forgot his water bottle and jogged back to camp alone. As he approached, he saw someone standing at the edge of their campsite, partially hidden behind a tree, just watching. The figure ducked back into the forest the moment David called out. David told Ann about it that evening, and they both agreed to be more vigilant. That night, David heard footsteps circling their tents. He unzipped his tent and looked out, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing except fresh boot prints in the dirt that definitely weren't theirs. The prints were everywhere, weaving between their tents, stopping at each entrance, circling the fire pit. Someone had been walking through their camp while they slept. In the morning, David drove to the nearest ranger station, which was almost an hour away. He reported the incident and asked if other campers had reported anything similar. The rangers said they'd increase patrols, but admitted the area was vast and they were understaffed. Here's what made it worse. When David returned to camp, Ann pulled him aside with a shaking voice. While he was gone, the girls had been playing near the lake when Lily saw a man standing in the trees, watching them, not hiking, not doing anything, just standing there, perfectly still, staring. When Ann ran over, the man was gone. But they found a spot in the bushes where the grass was flattened, as if someone had been sitting there for a long time. And next to that spot was a collection of cigarette butts, at least 20 of them, and a small pile of food wrappers. Someone had been sitting there for hours, watching their campsite, watching her daughters play. David wanted to leave immediately, but their vehicle wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead, which made no sense because it had been fine that morning. David checked under the hood and found the battery cables had been loosened. Not broken, not corroded. Deliberately loosened. Someone had sabotaged their vehicle. David's father-in-law suggested they hike out to the main road and flag down help. But that was a 12-mile hike, and it would be dark soon. Anne tried her cell phone, but there was no signal. They'd specifically chosen this location because it was so remote. Now that remoteness felt like a trap. But what happened next sealed their fate. As darkness fell, 10-year-old Lily whispered to her mother, "That man is standing right outside our tent." Anne felt her heart stop. She could see a shadow through the tent fabric, a human silhouette, perfectly still, just inches from where Lily was sitting. David grabbed the camping hatchet they'd brought for firewood and burst out of his tent, yelling. The figure ran into the darkness. David chased after it for a few yards, but stopped when he realized he was being lured away from his family. He ran back to find all their food supplies scattered, their water containers emptied, and their tent stakes pulled up. The attack had begun. They made a desperate decision. They would stay together in the largest tent, taking shifts to keep watch. And at first light, they would hike out as a group. David gathered every potential weapon he could find. The hatchet, a large knife, tent stakes, anything. Anne kept the girls close, trying to keep them calm, telling them it was probably just a confused hiker or someone mentally ill who needed help. But Anne didn't believe that. The way this person had been watching them, studying them, sabotaging their escape. This was calculated. This was predatory. As they huddled together, they heard footsteps again, circling them, stopping occasionally as if the person was standing there, listening, planning. Around 2 a.m., they heard something that made their blood run cold. The sound of their other tents being torn apart, ripping fabric, snapping poles, belongings being thrown around. The person wasn't even trying to be quiet anymore. He wanted them to hear it, wanted them to know he was taking his time, that they were trapped. David held the hatchet and positioned himself at the tent entrance. His father-in-law held the knife. The women and girls huddled behind them. The footsteps moved closer to their tent. They could hear breathing just outside. Then a voice, calm and quiet, said, "I know you're all in there." Sophie, the eldest daughter, at 16, would later tell police that her father made a decision in that moment. He whispered to Sophie that no matter what happened, she was to stay perfectly still and silent. Play dead if she had to. He told her that someone would find them eventually, and she needed to survive to tell people what happened. Then David burst out of the tent with a hatchet, screaming, charging at the man. Sophie heard the struggle, heard her father fighting, heard her grandfather rush out to help. She heard her mother scream. She heard Lily crying. And then, one by one, she heard them all go silent. Sophie lay in her sleeping bag, not moving, as the man entered the tent. She felt him step over her. She felt him check each body. She held her breath as he stood above her for what felt like an eternity. Then he left. She heard him walking away, heard him rummaging through their belongings, heard a vehicle start somewhere in the distance. She waited. Hours passed. Dawn came. Only then did Sophie open her eyes. She was the only one left alive. She crawled out of the tent, stepped over her family, and ran. She ran for 7 hours straight, following the trail back toward civilization, not stopping even when her legs gave out, crawling when she had to. A couple in an RV found her on the side of the road, covered in dirt and blood that wasn't hers, unable to speak, in complete shock. Police arrived at the campsite that afternoon. The scene was exactly as Sophie would later describe. 4 members of the Peterson family dead: David, Anne, Lily, and David's father-in-law. Only Anne's elderly mother and Sophie had survived. Sophie because she'd played dead, and her grandmother because she'd hidden in the forest in her confused state and wasn't found by the killer. The investigation revealed that the family had been stalked methodically. Police found a makeshift camp about 200 yards from the Petersons' campsite. The stalker had been living there for at least a week before the family arrived, and he'd stayed there the entire 4 days, watching them through binoculars, taking notes in a journal that was never recovered. They never caught him. Despite a massive manhunt, the killer vanished. Police believe he knew the area intimately, had planned multiple escape routes, and had possibly done this before. 3 other families had disappeared in similar circumstances in British Columbia over the previous decade. Remote campsites, evidence of stalking, no witnesses, no arrests. Sophie spent 2 years in therapy, unable to speak about that night. She still can't camp. She can't be in isolated areas. She checks every shadow, every parked car, every person who lingers too long, because she knows he's still out there. And sometimes, late at night, she wonders if he knows she survived. If he's watching her still, waiting for another perfect moment. Story 5. The Mushroom Picker's Discovery. Chen was staring at photographs of himself taped to trees, dozens of them, showing him from that morning, from angles where no one should have been. In one photo, he was bending over examining a mushroom patch. In another, he was drinking from his water bottle. In another, he was looking directly at the camera without knowing it. Someone had been following him through the forest for hours, photographing his every move, and he'd never noticed. Then he heard it. The unmistakable click of a camera shutter from somewhere in the trees behind him. Let me explain how he got there. Chen was an experienced forager who'd spent 20 years exploring remote British Columbia forests, searching for rare mushrooms. He knew these woods better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. That September morning, he'd driven 3 hours to access a particularly isolated area known for producing matsutake and chanterelles. The weather was perfect, cool and misty, exactly the conditions that brought out the best specimens. He parked at an abandoned logging road and hiked 2 miles into old-growth forest, seeing no one, hearing nothing but birds and wind through the trees. But what happened next changed everything. Around noon, Chen stumbled upon a clearing he'd never seen before, despite hiking this area for years. In the center of the clearing was a campsite, but something about it felt immediately wrong. A tent was still set up, fully erected and zipped closed. A portable camp table had food sitting on it, partially eaten, with flies buzzing around. Personal items were scattered everywhere. A jacket draped over a chair, hiking boots placed neatly by the tent entrance, a book lying open as if someone had just put it down. But there were no people, no sounds of anyone nearby. Just an abandoned camp with everything still in place. Chen called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. He walked closer, his foraging instincts telling him something was deeply wrong with this scene. The food on the table was rotting, covered in mold, meaning it had been sitting there for days, maybe weeks. But the tent looked maintained. No tears, no weather damage. The sleeping bags inside were arranged in a strange pattern, laid out in a perfect circle with the heads pointing inward. Chen had never seen sleeping bags arranged like that. Then he noticed the photographs, dozens of them, taped to the trees surrounding the clearing in a complete circle. He walked over to examine them. Here's what made it worse. The photographs were of him. Recent photographs. Chen recognized his red jacket, the one he was wearing right then. In one photo, he was examining a mushroom patch he'd visited just 2 hours earlier that morning. In another, he was drinking from his water bottle at a spot about a mile back. In another, he was checking his GPS device. Someone had been following him since he'd entered the forest, photographing him from hidden positions. And he'd never seen them, never heard them, never had any indication he wasn't alone. Chen felt his blood turn to ice as he studied each photograph. Some were taken from ground level, others from elevated positions in trees, all showing him completely unaware. But what happened next made him realize the true horror of his situation. He heard a camera shutter click from somewhere in the woods behind him. Then another click from a different direction. Then another. Multiple cameras, multiple positions, all pointing at him right now. Someone, or multiple someones, were photographing him at this exact moment, standing in this clearing, looking at photographs of himself. Chen spun around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just dense forest and shadows. Another click, this time closer. Chen made a split-second decision and ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, abandoning his careful forager's path, just running in what he hoped was the direction of his vehicle. Behind him, he could hear movement. Branches snapping, footsteps that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The forest seemed to close in around him. Twice he fell, scrambling back to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't tell if he was being chased or if panic was making him imagine the sounds. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, he burst out onto the logging road and saw his truck. He'd never been so relieved to see anything in his life. Chen got in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for several minutes before he could even get the key in the ignition. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. He drove straight to the nearest RCMP station, which was almost an hour away, and reported everything. 2 officers accompanied him back to the location that afternoon. Chen led them to the clearing, though it took them almost 2 hours to find it again, because in his panic he hadn't marked the route clearly. When they finally arrived, the campsite was still there. The tent, the table, the scattered belongings, everything exactly as Chen had described. But what the officers found made this case far more disturbing. The tent and camping gear belonged to a family that had been reported missing 6 months earlier. The Mackenzie family, 2 parents and their teenage son, had gone camping in this general area and never returned. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of them had been found until now. The officers examined the photographs taped to the trees. All the photos of Chen were there, along with dozens of other photographs of different people, hikers and campers photographed without their knowledge. Some of the photos dating back years based on the fading and weather damage. This had been going on for a very long time. The officers immediately called for backup and a forensic team. Chen gave his statement and was told to go home, that they would contact him if they needed anything else. As he drove away, Chen noticed something in his rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the logging road, watching him leave. Just standing there. Chen pressed the accelerator harder. He never returned to those woods. But that's not where this story ends. Not even close. 2 weeks later, Chen received a manila envelope in his mailbox. No return address. No postage. Someone had hand-delivered it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Chen standing in his own living room, taken from outside his window from the previous night. He was wearing his bathrobe, making tea, completely unaware he was being photographed. The police increased patrols around his neighborhood and installed security cameras at his house. Chen stopped going into the woods entirely, stopped foraging, started checking over his shoulder constantly. Every month since then, he receives another photograph. Sometimes it shows him at the grocery store, sometimes at work, sometimes walking his dog. Always taken without his knowledge, always delivered by hand to his mailbox with no way to trace who left it. The police have never caught whoever is doing this. The investigation into the Mackenzie family's disappearance revealed that their camp had been staged. They hadn't been camping there. They'd been brought there, and someone had arranged their belongings to make it look like an active campsite. The police theorize that whoever is responsible uses the staged campsite as a base to stalk and photograph people in the forest. The photographs of Chen were likely taken as trophies, proof of successful stalking. But why? What's the purpose? The police have no answers. More disturbing, when forensic teams searched the area around the clearing, they found multiple other campsites hidden in the dense forest, each one staged with belongings from different missing persons cases spanning over a decade. At least 15 different people's belongings, all arranged in these creepy staged camps, none of the people ever found. Chen knows he's lucky. He got away. But the monthly photographs are a reminder that whoever this is, they're still watching, still following, still taking pictures. Chen moved to a different city 3 months ago, didn't tell anyone where he was going, changed his phone number, deleted his social media. For 6 weeks, no photographs arrived. He started to feel safe again. Then last Tuesday, he found another manila envelope in his new mailbox. Inside was a photograph of him moving boxes into his new apartment, taken from across the street. Written on the back in neat handwriting was a single sentence: "Found you again." Chen doesn't know what to do anymore. The police say they're doing everything they can, but this person seems to be able to find him anywhere. Sometimes Chen wonders if running away is even possible, or if he's just a permanent target now. Someone this stalker will never stop following, never stop photographing, keeping track of forever. Story 6. The Night Shift Campers. Tyler was staring at 3 figures standing at the edge of the campfire light, perfectly still, watching him in complete silence. The figures looked exactly like his friends, Simone, Han, and Brittany, down to the clothes they were wearing, the way they stood, even their facial features. But Tyler had just checked the tents 30 seconds ago. All 3 of his friends were asleep inside. He'd seen them with his own eyes, heard them breathing. So who, or what, was standing out there wearing their faces? Let me explain how they got there. 4 college students, Tyler, Simone, Han, and Brittany, had planned this camping trip for weeks. They'd chosen a popular national forest campground, not too remote, with other campers nearby for safety. They'd heard stories about recent break-ins at campsites in the area, reports of people having their gear stolen or their tents slashed while they hiked during the day. So they decided to be smart about it. They would take shifts watching the camp through the night, 2 hours each, just to make sure no one messed with their stuff while they slept. It seemed like a reasonable precaution. But what happened next changed everything. The first night, Tyler volunteered for the first shift, from midnight to 2 a.m. Everyone else settled into their tents, and Tyler sat by the fire, occasionally adding wood to keep it burning, scrolling through downloaded podcasts on his phone to stay awake. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard footsteps approaching from the darkness. He looked up expecting to see another camper walking back from the bathroom facilities. Instead, he saw Simone, Han, and Brittany standing together about 20 feet away, right at the edge where firelight faded into darkness. They were just standing there, side by side, staring at him, not moving, not speaking. Tyler called out to them, confused. "Hey guys, what are you doing? Why are you all out here?" They didn't respond. They just stood there, their faces expressionless, eyes reflecting the firelight in an odd way. Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way they were standing, perfectly still, perfectly synchronized, felt wrong. He stood up and called out again, louder this time. "Seriously, this isn't funny. What's going on?" Still no response. Then Tyler heard something that made his blood run cold. From inside the tents, he heard snoring. He heard Simone's distinctive laugh snore, the one she always made fun of herself for. He heard Han mumbling in his sleep, like he always did. Here's what made it worse. Tyler grabbed his flashlight and walked quickly to the tents. He unzipped Simone's tent. She was there, asleep in her sleeping bag, phone on the ground next to her pillow. He checked Han's tent. Han was there, curled up, definitely asleep. He checked Brittany's tent. She was there too, sleeping peacefully. Tyler's hands started shaking. If they were all in their tents, who was standing out there? He turned around slowly, shining his flashlight toward where the figures had been standing. They were gone. Just empty darkness. Tyler didn't sleep the rest of his shift. He sat with his back against a tree, watching the tents, watching the darkness, his heart pounding. In the morning, he told everyone what had happened. They didn't believe him at first, thought maybe he dozed off and had a vivid dream. But Tyler insisted it was real, insisted he'd checked all their tents and they were definitely asleep. Simone suggested maybe it was other campers playing a prank. Han said maybe Tyler had been seeing things because he was tired. They almost convinced him. Almost. But that second night, Han took the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift. And at 3:15 a.m., he woke everyone up screaming. He'd seen them too. Tyler, Simone, and Brittany standing at the edge of camp, watching him. But when he'd checked, all three of them were asleep in their tents. But what happened next made them realize this was something far more sinister than pranks or tired eyes. The third night, they decided to test it. They would all stay awake together during one shift, all four of them sitting by the fire, no one in the tents. If the figures appeared, they'd all see it, and they'd know for certain something was wrong. At 1 a.m., sitting together around the fire, they heard footsteps. All four of them heard it this time, multiple sets of footsteps circling their campsite just beyond the firelight. Then they appeared. 4 figures, standing in a line, facing them. The figures looked exactly like them. Same clothes, same hair, same builds. They were looking at mirror images of themselves. Brittany screamed. Tyler grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a heavy branch. Han turned on his phone's flashlight and shone it at the figures. In the bright LED light, the figures' faces became clearer, and what they saw made Simone start crying. The faces were almost right, but not quite. The eyes were slightly too far apart. The mouths were too wide. The proportions were just a little off, like someone had described them to an artist who'd never seen them before. And the artist had done their best, but couldn't get it quite right. The figures stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just watching, then turned in perfect synchronization and walked back into the darkness. The 4 friends packed up their camp that night and drove straight home. But the story doesn't end there. Over the following weeks, each of them experienced something disturbing. Simone's roommate asked her why she'd been standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. just staring at her door. Simone had been asleep. Han's neighbor reported seeing him standing in his own front yard at night, facing the house, not moving. Han had been out of town that weekend. Brittany's co-workers mentioned seeing her in the parking garage, just standing by her car, not getting in, not leaving, just standing there for over an hour. Brittany had called in sick that day and was at home. Tyler's girlfriend broke up with him because she said he'd been standing outside her apartment building for 3 nights in a row. Tyler had proof he'd been at his parents' house those nights. Here's what made them finally go to the police. Tyler received a video file from an unknown email address. No message, just a video attachment. When he opened it, it showed footage of their campsite from that trip. The footage was from a camera they'd never seen, hidden somewhere in the trees, recording them for all 3 days. The video showed their entire stay, every meal, every conversation, every moment they'd spent at that campsite. But it also showed something else. Every night, while they slept, a figure would enter their camp. Just one figure. Moving between their tents, standing over them while they slept, studying them. The figure would spend hours just watching them sleep, occasionally reaching out to touch their faces through the tent fabric, tracing their features. But what was most disturbing was what the figure did after watching them. It would stand in the center of their camp, under the moonlight, and practice. Practice walking like Tyler, then practice walking like Simone, then Han, then Brittany. The figure would cycle through their movements, their gestures, their mannerisms, over and over, like an actor rehearsing, learning them, copying them. The video showed this happening every single night they were there. The figure had been studying them, learning how to become them. The police took the video seriously. They investigated and found the camera still mounted in a tree at that campsite. But it wasn't just one camera. They found 7 cameras positioned around that specific campsite, all recording, all still active. When they reviewed all the footage, they discovered something that made this case even more terrifying. The cameras had been there for over 2 years, and they'd recorded dozens of different camping groups. And in every single recording, the same pattern appeared. A figure would watch the campers while they slept, then practice mimicking them. The police traced the camera's wireless signals to a receiver located 3 miles away in an old cabin. When they raided the cabin, they found it empty. But the walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them. Photos of different people, all taken at that campsite, all showing close-ups of faces, hands, body postures. There were detailed notes written on the photos, observations about how each person moved, talked, gestured. They also found journals, dozens of them, filled with practice notes. Subject 14 smiles more with the left side of their mouth. Subject 22 walks with a slight limp. Subject 31 touches their hair when nervous. Hundreds of pages of observations about people who'd camped at that site, detailed analyses of their behavior, their appearance, everything. The police theorized that whoever had been doing this was studying people, learning to impersonate them perfectly. But for what purpose? Was this preparation for identity theft? For something worse? They never found the person responsible. The cabin had been abandoned recently, maybe just days before the raid. Whoever it was knew they were coming. Tyler, Simone, Han, and Brittany still see the figures sometimes, standing across the street from their apartments, in parking lots at night, always at a distance, always just watching. The police advised them to document every sighting, install security cameras, never be alone. But here's what terrifies them most. A few weeks ago, Tyler's mother called him, crying. She said Tyler had stopped by her house that afternoon while she was napping. She woke up to find him standing in her bedroom doorway, just standing there, watching her sleep. When she called out to him, he turned and left without saying a word. But Tyler had been at work that entire afternoon. His boss confirmed it. He had dozens of witnesses. So who was standing in his mother's bedroom wearing his face? Story 7. The teeth. Oscar was staring at human teeth scattered in a perfect circle around where he'd slept, at least 50 of them, some with bloody roots still attached, some worn smooth like they'd been kept for years. They weren't there when he'd gone to sleep 6 hours ago? Someone, or something, had arranged them while he lay unconscious just feet away, creating a grotesque barrier around his sleeping bag. And the smell, that horrible rotting smell he'd noticed yesterday, was so much stronger now. Let me explain how he got there. Oscar was a seasoned outdoorsman who'd been camping solo in Colorado wilderness for over 20 years. He knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. That October, he'd planned a week-long trip to a remote area he'd visited many times before. A beautiful valley with a stream running through it, surrounded by pine forests and rocky outcroppings. He'd set up his camp on the second day, choosing a flat area near the stream with good visibility in all directions. Everything seemed normal. He cooked dinner, purified some water, and settled in for the night as the sun set behind the mountains. But what happened next changed everything. Around midnight, Oscar woke up to that smell. It was overwhelming, like decomposing meat mixed with something chemical, something that made his eyes water and his stomach turn. He assumed a deer or elk had died nearby, maybe dragged there by a mountain lion. It was unpleasant, but not uncommon in the wilderness. He covered his nose with his shirt and tried to go back to sleep, figuring he'd investigate in the morning and maybe move his campsite if the smell was too bad. He eventually dozed off despite the odor. When Oscar woke at dawn, the smell was even worse. But what made him sit bolt upright in his sleeping bag was what he saw around him. Teeth. Human teeth. Arranged in a perfect circle around his sleeping area, each tooth placed carefully upright in the dirt, creating a ring maybe 8 feet in diameter. Oscar scrambled out of his sleeping bag and stood in the center of the circle, his heart pounding. He counted them. 53 teeth. Molars, incisors, canines. Some still had bits of root and tissue attached, dark red and fresh. Others were old, yellowed, smooth. This was a collection. Someone's collection. Here's what made it worse. Oscar noticed a trail leading away from his campsite. Not a trail of footprints, but a trail of teeth. Every 10 feet or so, a single tooth placed in the center of what looked like a game trail heading into a rocky area about a quarter-mile away. It was deliberate. Someone wanted him to follow it. Every instinct Oscar had screamed at him to pack up and leave immediately. But Oscar had spent his life in these mountains. He dealt with bears, mountain lions, aggressive moose. He wasn't going to be scared off by some sick person's idea of a prank. He grabbed his hunting knife, his can of bear spray, and his flashlight, even though it was daylight. Then he followed the trail of teeth. The trail led him up a rocky incline toward a cave system he'd noticed on previous trips, but never explored. The teeth continued right up to the cave entrance, then stopped. Oscar stood at the mouth of the cave, peering into darkness. The smell was coming from inside, so strong now it was almost visible, like a physical presence. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, opening into a chamber about the size of a small room. And that's when Oscar saw what he'd never be able to unsee. Someone was living here. But what happened next made him realize this wasn't just someone homeless taking shelter. There was a sleeping area made from stolen camping gear. Sleeping bags he recognized from missing persons posters he'd seen at trailheads. There were food stores, canned goods, dried meat hanging from the ceiling, some of it clearly not animal meat based on the way it was butchered. And along one wall, arranged on natural rock shelves, were jars. Mason jars, hundreds of them, each filled with teeth. Thousands of teeth. Each jar was labeled with dates going back over 15 years. Some jars contained teeth that were clearly from children, small, with some baby teeth still mixed in. Oscar felt bile rise in his throat. He took photos with his phone, knowing no one would believe this without evidence. That's when he heard breathing. Deep in the cave, past the main chamber, in the darkness his flashlight couldn't quite reach. Something was breathing. Slow, rhythmic, like someone sleeping, or like someone pretending to sleep. Oscar backed toward the cave entrance, keeping his light pointed ahead, his hand on his bear spray. The breathing continued, unchanged. When Oscar reached the cave mouth, he ran. He didn't pack up his camp. He didn't grab anything except his phone and car keys from his tent pocket. He ran the 3 miles back to where he'd parked his truck, stumbling over rocks, branches tearing at his clothes, not looking back once. He drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything. 2 rangers and 3 sheriff's deputies accompanied him back to the cave that afternoon, all of them armed. When they arrived, Oscar's campsite was untouched. The circle of teeth was still there. The trail leading to the cave was still there. But when they entered the cave, everything was gone. No sleeping bags, no food stores, no jars of teeth. Nothing. Just an empty cave that showed signs of recent habitation, flattened areas where things had been, soot marks from fires, but no evidence of what Oscar had photographed. Except Oscar had his photos. He showed them to the rangers. The expressions on their faces told him they believed him, even if the evidence was gone. The rangers told Oscar this wasn't the first report they'd received about this area. Over the past decade, there had been occasional reports of strange findings, campers reporting teeth scattered at their campsites, hikers finding jars hidden in tree hollows. One ranger admitted they'd found a molar nailed to a trail marker 2 years ago, but it had been dismissed as a weird prank. The deputies checked the serial numbers on the sleeping bags Oscar had photographed against missing persons cases. 3 of them matched gear belonging to hikers who disappeared in this region over the past 8 years. None of those hikers had ever been found. But here's what made this case truly disturbing. A forensic anthropologist examined Oscar's photos and identified teeth from at least 40 different individuals based on unique dental characteristics. Some of the teeth were old enough that they could have been collected decades ago. This person, whoever they were, had been doing this for a very long time. The cave system was extensively searched. They found 3 other chambers deeper in the mountain, all showing signs of recent use, all empty now. They found carved symbols on the walls, tallies, numbers that didn't mean anything to investigators. They found ash pits with burned bone fragments. The fragments were sent for DNA analysis. The results came back as human remains from multiple individuals. A task force was formed. The case was elevated to a federal investigation. They called him the Tooth Collector. Despite extensive searches, trail cameras, stakeouts, and publicity, he was never found. But the reports continued. Every few months, somewhere in Colorado's wilderness, a camper would report finding teeth arranged around their campsite. Always in a circle. Always while they slept. Sometimes it would be just a few teeth. Sometimes dozens. The pattern suggested the Tooth Collector was still active, still collecting, still living somewhere in those vast mountains. Rangers started warning campers about certain areas, though they couldn't close thousands of square miles of public land based on sporadic incidents. Oscar never camped alone again. He sold most of his gear and stuck to day hikes, always in groups, always in well-trafficked areas. But the experience changed him in ways he couldn't articulate. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up convinced he could smell that rotting smell, that chemical decomposition odor from the cave. He'd check his windows, his doors, making sure everything was locked. He started having dreams about the breathing he'd heard in that cave. That slow, deliberate breathing that suggested someone fully aware and waiting. In his dreams, he'd see a figure sitting in darkness, surrounded by jars of teeth, carefully adding new specimens to the collection, organizing them by type, by age, by some system only the collector understood. The worst part, the thing that kept Oscar awake most nights, was a detail he'd noticed in one of his photos, but hadn't mentioned to anyone. On the rock shelf next to the jars, there had been a small notebook. He'd zoomed in on that photo later, enhancing it as much as his phone would allow. The notebook was open to a page with a list of names. Oscar recognized 3 of them from missing persons cases he'd seen on the news. His name was on that list too, written at the bottom in neat handwriting, with yesterday's date next to it. The tooth collector had been planning to add Oscar to his collection. And if Oscar hadn't woken up when he did, if he'd slept through the night, he might have become another unsolved disappearance in Colorado's wilderness, his teeth added to one of those jars, labeled with the date he vanished. Story 8. The Grizzly Night. Maya was clinging to a tree branch 30 feet above the ground, her arms shaking with exhaustion, watching a massive grizzly bear circle below her for the 9th straight hour. The bear wasn't searching for food. It wasn't confused or curious. It was hunting her specifically, deliberately, with a terrifying intelligence in its eyes. Every 20 minutes, it would rise up on its hind legs, reaching toward her with claws the size of kitchen knives, swiping at her boots that dangled just barely out of reach. Maya's friends were scattered somewhere in the darkness of Montana's glacier backcountry. 2 of them were already dead. She could still hear their screams echoing in her memory. Let me explain how they got there. 5 friends, Maya, Justin, Kara, Derek, and Amanda, had planned this camping trip for over a year. All of them were experienced outdoors enthusiasts who'd done dozens of camping trips together. They'd chosen Glacier National Park's backcountry specifically because they wanted a challenge, wanted to experience true wilderness. They'd obtained all the proper permits, attended the mandatory bear safety briefing, purchased bear-proof containers for their food, and carried bear spray on their belts. They'd done everything right. They'd followed every protocol. They thought they were prepared. But what happened next changed everything. They set up camp on their second night in a beautiful meadow surrounded by dense pine forest, with a small stream running nearby. The ranger who'd issued their permit had even recommended this specific area as relatively safe and well-trafficked during summer months. They hung their food properly in bear-proof containers suspended from a tree branch 200 feet from their tents, exactly as instructed. They cooked and ate their dinner away from their sleeping area. They cleaned their dishes thoroughly. They stored their toiletries with the food. They did everything by the book. At around 10 p.m., they sat around their campfire sharing stories, completely relaxed, feeling like they'd found paradise. At 3 a.m., Maya woke to a sound she'd never forget. The sound of fabric ripping, violent and loud, followed by Justin screaming. Not a startled yell, but a scream of pure agony and terror that cut through the night and made Maya's blood freeze. She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and unzipped her tent just in time to see a massive grizzly bear, easily 700 pounds, completely destroying Justin's tent with him still inside it. The bear wasn't going for their food. The food was exactly where they'd hung it, untouched and secure. The bear was attacking Justin deliberately, systematically, with a focused aggression that seemed almost intentional. Here's what made it worse. Derek and Kara burst out of their tent with their bear spray, yelling and making noise exactly as they'd been trained to do. Most bears will flee from loud noises and aggressive behavior. This bear didn't even pause. It turned from Justin's destroyed tent and charged directly at Derek. Derek deployed his bear spray, a direct hit to the bear's face from maybe 10 feet away. The bear shook its head, slowed for maybe 2 seconds, then continued its charge. Derek tried to run. The bear was faster. Maya watched helplessly as the bear took Derek down with one swipe that sent him flying through the air like he weighed nothing. The sound of his impact against a tree trunk was sickening. But what happened next revealed this wasn't a random attack. The bear didn't maul Derek or Justin further once they were down. It turned and systematically began destroying each tent, one by one, ripping through the fabric, scattering gear, forcing everyone out into the open. This wasn't about territory or feeling threatened. This bear was separating them, exposing them, creating chaos. Maya grabbed her flashlight and her bear spray and ran. She heard Amanda screaming behind her, heard Kara yelling at everyone to scatter into the woods. The bear safety briefing had said, never run, never separate. Stay together and make yourself look big. But their instincts overrode their training. They scattered. Maya ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping her face, roots trying to trip her. She could hear the bear crashing through the undergrowth behind her, could hear its breathing, heavy and deliberate. She spotted a large pine tree with low branches and made a decision. She jumped for the lowest branch, pulled herself up with adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she had, and climbed. She climbed until her arms burned, until she was 30 feet up. Wedged against the trunk on a branch she prayed would hold her weight. Below, the grizzly arrived at the base of the tree seconds later. It looked up at her with eyes that caught her flashlight beam, eyes that showed awareness and calculation. Then it settled into a sitting position and waited. Maya clung to that tree for 9 hours. For the first hour, she could hear sounds from the campsite in the distance. Screams. More destruction. The bear would occasionally leave her tree, disappear for 20 or 30 minutes, and she'd hear those sounds increase. Then it would return and resume its position below her, looking up, waiting. As dawn began to break, the sounds from camp stopped. Maya was alone with the bear. Her arms were completely numb. Her legs were cramping so badly she thought she might fall. The bear seemed to sense her weakness. Every time she'd start to drift off from exhaustion, it would stand and swipe at the tree trunk, shaking the entire tree, jolting her awake. Here's what made this truly horrifying. Around 8 a.m., Maya heard voices. Hikers on a nearby trail, probably heading to a popular overlook. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The bear heard them, though. It stood up, looked in the direction of the voices, then looked back up at Maya. For a moment, she thought it might leave to investigate the hikers. Instead, it sat back down and continued waiting. It chose to stay with her rather than investigate easier prey. That's when Maya realized this bear wasn't acting on instinct. It had been conditioned somehow, trained almost, to associate humans with something. Maybe food, maybe entertainment, maybe something worse. At 11 a.m., Maya heard a helicopter. The chopping sound of rotor blades in the distance, getting closer. Someone must have reported them overdue, or a ranger was doing routine patrols. The helicopter passed overhead, but didn't spot her through the dense canopy. The bear didn't react to the helicopter at all, didn't seem bothered or scared by the noise. It just sat there, occasionally standing to reach toward her, occasionally circling the tree, but always returning to wait. Maya tried waving her flashlight, tried using the emergency whistle on her backpack strap that she'd somehow managed to keep. But the helicopter moved on. The bear remained. Finally, at noon, 12 hours after the attack began, Maya heard something that made her sob with relief. Dogs. Search and rescue dogs, their barking getting closer. The bear heard them too. This time, it reacted differently. It stood, looked up at Maya one more time with those intelligent, calculating eyes, then turned and loped off into the forest. Not running, not scared, just leaving, like it had finished whatever it was doing. 10 minutes later, a search and rescue team found her. They had to talk her down from the tree because her limbs were so locked from cramping and fear that she couldn't climb down on her own. When she finally reached the ground, her legs gave out and she collapsed. The search team had already been to the campsite. Justin and Derek were dead. Derek had died from massive trauma, probably within minutes of being attacked. Justin had survived longer, but had bled out before anyone could reach him. Amanda was found hiding in a hollowed-out log 200 yards from camp, severely injured but alive. Kara was never found. Search teams combed the area for days. They found blood, they found scraps of her clothing, but they never found Kara. The grizzly bear was eventually tracked and killed 2 days later by wildlife officials. When they performed the necropsy, they found human remains in its stomach. But they also found something else that explained everything. The bear had been tagged years earlier as part of a wildlife study. Its tag number identified it as a problem bear that had been relocated multiple times for approaching campsites and acting aggressively. But here's the truly awful part. The bear had been regularly fed by a group of tourists who'd rented a cabin near the park 3 years prior. Park rangers had warned the tourists multiple times, had even cited them, but the damage was done. The bear had learned to associate humans with food. It had lost all natural fear. When it stopped receiving handouts, it had apparently started hunting humans as a food source. The attack on Maya's group was its 4th confirmed attack on campers. 3 previous attacks had gone unreported or unsolved because the victims had been solo hikers whose disappearances were attributed to accidents or getting lost. Maya spent 3 months in physical therapy, recovering from the injuries to her arms and legs from clinging to that tree. She spent 2 years in psychological therapy, dealing with survivors' guilt and PTSD. She can't be in forests anymore. She can't hear certain sounds, like fabric ripping or heavy breathing, without having panic attacks. She has nightmares about those 9 hours in the tree, about watching the bear return again and again, about hearing her friends die while she hid in branches, unable to help them. But what haunts her most is remembering the bear's eyes, the intelligence in them, the patience, the way it chose to wait for her rather than leave when it heard other hikers or the helicopter. Wildlife officials confirmed that this was not normal bear behavior. This bear had been fundamentally altered by human interaction, had learned behaviors that made it one of the most dangerous animals in North American history. The tourists who'd fed it years earlier faced criminal charges, but nothing that matched the magnitude of what their actions had caused. They'd essentially created a killing machine by undermining the bear's natural instincts. Maya advocates now for stricter penalties for people who feed wildlife and for better education about why it's not just illegal, but deadly. Because she knows that somewhere out there might be another bear being fed by ignorant tourists, another bear learning that humans are food, Another group of campers following all the safety rules and thinking they're prepared, not knowing that human stupidity from years ago has already sealed their fate. Story 9. The Inheritance Cabin. Fiona was staring out the cabin window at dozens of lights in the surrounding forest, perfectly still, at eye level, never moving, never blinking, arranged in a perfect circle around the property. They'd been there for 6 hours now, and according to her dead uncle's journal, they'd been there for 20 years. The journal entry she'd just read, the final one he'd written before his death, was still open on the table. They're not lights. They're eyes. And tonight they're coming closer. As if responding to her reading those words, the lights began to move forward in unison, maintaining their circle formation, advancing toward the cabin. Let me explain how she got there. Fiona had inherited a remote cabin from her estranged Uncle Raymond, a man she'd only met twice in her life at family gatherings. When the lawyer called to inform her of the inheritance, Fiona was surprised. She'd never been close to Uncle Raymond. He'd been the family oddball, the one who'd moved to the mountains decades ago and cut off most contact with everyone. The lawyer explained that the cabin sat on 5 acres of forested land in northern Idaho, was completely paid off, and was now hers. Fiona could sell it, rent it, or keep it. But the lawyer strongly suggested she visit it first before making any decisions. But what happened next changed everything. Fiona drove out there on a Friday afternoon in late October, planning to spend the night at the property to get a feel for it before deciding whether to keep or sell. The cabin was more isolated than she'd expected, requiring a 30-minute drive down a poorly maintained dirt road from the nearest town. When she arrived, the property was exactly as the lawyer had described. A small but well-maintained cabin with solar panels on the roof, a woodshed, and a cleared area around it. But the forest surrounding the property was dense, almost oppressively so, with massive old-growth trees creating a canopy that made everything dim even in afternoon light. Inside, the cabin was neat, but unsettling. Uncle Raymond had clearly lived there until his death 6 months ago. His belongings were still exactly where he'd left them. Books stacked everywhere. Canned food in the pantry, clothes in the closet. But what caught Fiona's attention immediately were the windows. Every single window had thick wooden shutters on the inside, reinforced with metal brackets and multiple heavy-duty locks. Not on the outside for storm protection, but on the inside, as if he'd been trying to keep something out, or keep something from looking in. Fiona found that odd, but attributed it to her uncle's eccentric nature. Here's what made it worse. As Fiona explored the cabin, she found stacks of journals, dozens of them, dating back 23 years to when Uncle Raymond first bought the property. Out of curiosity, she opened the most recent one, dated the week before his death. The entries were disturbing. Uncle Raymond wrote about the watchers in the trees who appeared every night. He documented their positions on hand-drawn maps, showing lights arranged in a circle around his property, always at the same height, always in the same positions. Entry after entry described them, sometimes clinical and observational, sometimes paranoid and rambling, sometimes terrified. Fiona read through several journals. The pattern was consistent. Uncle Raymond claimed that shortly after moving to the property, he'd noticed strange lights in the forest at night. At first, he'd assumed they were other cabins or campers, but when he tried to investigate, he never found any source. The lights would appear at dusk and remain until dawn, never moving, always watching. He'd reported them to local authorities, who'd investigated but found nothing. He'd brought friends to witness them, but when people visited, the lights wouldn't appear. Only when he was alone did they come. Over the years, his entries became increasingly desperate, mentioning how the lights seemed to be inching closer each year, how he felt watched constantly, how he couldn't leave because they won't let me. But what happened next made Fiona realize this wasn't just her uncle's paranoid delusions. As dusk fell and Fiona sat at the cabin table reading more journals, she glanced out the window and froze. There they were, lights in the forest, dozens of them, spread out in a wide circle around the property, each one at eye level, maybe 7 feet off the ground. Perfectly still, not flickering like campfires, not moving like flashlights, just steady, unwavering points of light, all facing toward the cabin. Fiona felt her heart rate increase. She grabbed her own flashlight and went outside, calling out to see if someone was playing a prank. No response. She walked toward the nearest light, maybe 50 yards away. As she got closer, the light remained stationary. But when she was about 20 feet away, it blinked off. Just vanished. She swept her flashlight around, but saw nothing. No person, no equipment, nothing. Fiona returned to the cabin, disturbed but trying to rationalize. Maybe reflective markers on trees? Some kind of natural phenomenon. She pulled out her phone to search for explanations, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. She lit a fire in the wood stove and tried to relax, but she couldn't stop glancing out the windows. The lights were still there, all of them, watching. She pulled out Uncle Raymond's maps and compared them to what she was seeing. The positions were identical. Every single light was exactly where he'd marked them on maps drawn years ago. How was that possible? If they were people or pranksters, why would they be in the same exact spots years later? As night deepened, Fiona read more of Uncle Raymond's journals. The entries became increasingly unhinged toward the end. He wrote about trying to leave multiple times, but always returning because of an overwhelming compulsion. He wrote about the lights sometimes approaching the cabin windows on certain nights, particularly during new moons. He wrote about seeing what held the lights, tall figures, impossibly thin, with limbs too long to be human. He'd sketched them in his journal, disturbing drawings of humanoid shapes with elongated arms and legs, standing 8 or 9 feet tall. The drawings were crude but deeply unsettling, showing figures with faces that were almost human but not quite right. But what happened next made Fiona understand her uncle's terror. Around midnight, she checked the windows again. The lights had moved closer. Not dramatically, but noticeably. They'd been maybe 100 yards away earlier. Now they were maybe 75 yards away. Fiona pulled out Uncle Raymond's maps and checked his notes. He'd documented this behavior. On certain nights, the lights would advance toward the cabin in slow increments. Sometimes they'd retreat by dawn. Sometimes they'd maintain their new positions permanently, year after year, getting closer. According to his measurements, they'd started nearly a quarter-mile away when he first moved there. Now they were within 100 yards, a 23-year encroachment a point. She heard her uncle's voice outside, clear as day, calling her name, asking her to open the door. But Uncle Raymond had been dead for 6 months. Story 10. The Group That Never Left. 7-year-old Zoe was sleepwalking toward an empty campsite in the middle of the night, laughing and playing with children who weren't there, having a full conversation with invisible friends while her parents watched in horror. The campsite had been permanently closed for 30 years after a family with 3 children died there in a carbon monoxide poisoning incident in 1995. The names Zoe was calling out, Emma, Lucas, and Sophie, matched exactly the names of the children who died. Her parents had never told her those names. Let me explain how they got there. The Morrison family, parents Jeff and Sarah, and their daughter Zoe, had arrived at a popular Pennsylvania campground for a weekend getaway. They'd chosen this particular campground because it was family-friendly, well-maintained, and had good reviews online. They checked in at the ranger station, received their assigned campsite number, and drove to their spot. The campground was moderately busy with other families, the perfect atmosphere for a relaxing weekend. They set up their tent, inflated air mattresses, and Zoe immediately started exploring the area around their campsite, as kids do. But what happened next would change their lives forever. Within an hour of arriving, Zoe came running back to their campsite, excited and out of breath. She told her parents she'd made friends with kids at the neighboring campsite. 3 of them, she said. Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. They were going to play together all weekend. Sarah looked in the direction Zoe was pointing, at the campsite directly adjacent to theirs, maybe 50 feet away. The campsite was empty. No tent, no car, no people. Just an empty clearing with a picnic table and fire ring. Sarah assumed Zoe had gotten confused about which campsite her new friends were at, that she'd met kids somewhere else in the campground. But Zoe insisted. She pointed directly at the empty site and waved, calling out to her friends. Jeff walked over to check. The campsite was definitely empty. There was no evidence anyone had been there recently. The grass was overgrown around the fire ring. The picnic table was weathered and hadn't been used in a long time. Jeff noticed something odd. There was a small metal plaque attached to a post at the edge of the site, partially hidden by overgrowth. He pulled back the vegetation to read it. It was a memorial plaque. In memory of the Whitmore family, Emma, Lucas, Sophie, Michael, and Jennifer. Forever in our hearts. 1995. Here's what made it disturbing. Jeff felt a chill run down his spine. He called Sarah over and showed her the plaque. Those were the exact names Zoe had just said. Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. But how could Zoe have known those names? She couldn't have read the plaque from their campsite. It was too far away and too hidden. Sarah checked with Zoe again. Are you sure those are your friends' names? Zoe nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Emma is 8, Lucas is 6, and Sophie is my age. They said they've been here a really long time and they're so happy someone finally came to play with them. Jeff and Sarah exchanged worried looks, but decided not to alarm Zoe. Kids have active imaginations. Maybe she'd seen the plaque somehow and incorporated it into her pretend game without realizing it. They'd keep an eye on her, but let her play. Throughout that afternoon and evening, Zoe would periodically run over to the empty campsite and appear to play with invisible children. She'd laugh, talk, run around, play hide and seek behind trees. To anyone watching, she was playing alone. But Zoe insisted her friends were right there. At dinner, she asked if Emma, Lucas, and Sophie could join them. Jeff gently explained that they needed to eat dinner with their own family, wherever they were camping. But what happened next made them realize something was seriously wrong. After dinner, as darkness fell, Jeff decided to ask the campground ranger about that memorial plaque. He walked to the ranger station and inquired about campsite 14, the empty site next to theirs. The ranger's expression changed immediately. He asked why Jeff was asking. Jeff explained about the plaque and his daughter's imaginary friends. The ranger was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a thick binder of campground records. He showed Jeff a page. Campsite 14 had been permanently closed since 1995. It was never assigned to campers. It shouldn't even be visible as available. The ranger explained the history. 30 years ago, the Whitmore family had been camping at that site. Parents Michael and Jennifer, with their 3 children, Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. They'd had a propane heater in their tent because it was an unseasonably cold October weekend. Something went wrong with the heater during the night. Carbon monoxide leaked into the tent while they slept. All 5 family members died. They were found the next morning by another camper who'd noticed their tent was still zipped up late into the day. The campground permanently closed that site out of respect and installed the memorial plaque. For 30 years, no one had camped there. Here's what terrified Jeff. He asked the ranger what the children's ages had been. The ranger checked the old records. Emma was 8. Lucas was 6. Sophie was 7. The exact ages Zoe had told them. Jeff felt sick. He asked if there were any photos of the Whitmore children anywhere, wondering if Zoe might have seen them somehow. The ranger pulled out an old newspaper clipping from the incident. There was a family photo. Jeff looked at it and his hands started shaking. He walked back to his campsite in a daze. Sarah asked what the ranger had said. Jeff pulled her aside and told her everything in a whisper so Zoe wouldn't hear. But what happened next convinced them they needed to leave immediately. That night, around 10 p.m., Jeff and Sarah put Zoe to bed in their tent. They stayed outside by the fire for another hour, talking in quiet, worried tones about what to do. Should they leave tonight? Wait until morning? Was Zoe just having an elaborate, imaginative episode? Or was something genuinely wrong? Around 11 p.m., they checked on Zoe. She was fast asleep. They decided to stay the night but leave first thing in the morning. They went to bed themselves, exhausted from a day of concern. At 2 a.m., Sarah woke up to find Zoe's sleeping bag empty. She shook Jeff awake in a panic. They unzipped the tent and saw Zoe in her pajamas, walking toward campsite 14. She was sleepwalking, something she'd never done before in her life. But she wasn't just walking. She was talking, laughing, playing. Emma, wait for me. Lucas, you're it. Sophie, let's hide over here. She was having a full, animated conversation with invisible companions. Jeff ran after her and gently took her arm. Zoe turned to look at him, but her eyes were unfocused, still asleep. She said, "Daddy, we're just playing. Emma says they never get to play with anyone anymore. Everyone always leaves." Jeff carried Zoe back to their tent, but she kept talking in her sleep. "They're so lonely. They said they've been waiting for so long for someone to stay. They said most kids can't see them, but I can because I'm special. They want me to stay forever like them." Sarah was crying now, terrified. Jeff made the decision. They were leaving immediately. At 2:30 a.m., they packed up their campsite in the dark, loaded everything into their car, and drove away. Zoe woke up in the car, confused about why they were leaving in the middle of the night. She asked about Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. Sarah told her they had to go home because of an emergency. Zoe started crying, saying her friends would be sad she left without saying goodbye.